Okay, we are live, Sean.
All right, I am excited. This is great.
I know, me too. This is our first time together being live on, well, actually being live in general
Is
together.
that right? That might be right. Yeah, that's right. We're usually just doing recorded videos. Yeah.
I know we talk all the time, but never have done it live. So I'm really excited to do this.
Yes, likewise, likewise.
And our first live we're doing today is about kind of going behind the scenes, not only about drag and drop editors, but more specifically around content modeling. So, how you can model your content in a way that can be used with these drag and drop editors.
Great, great, great.
And Sean, I know you have, for those who haven't checked out Sean's blog or YouTube channel, definitely do. Sean, you're an expert. I'm claiming you as an expert in this area because you have written many different articles about this, and you're extremely knowledgeable. And for context, for people who are watching this, it's interesting because this is such an important topic, but something that I really didn't start thinking about until I joined Stackbit, which is kind of strange in many ways because it's so important. And now that I'm in this role, I'm like, okay, this is everything. And I think that brings us to the purpose of this talk is essentially to understand about how you can model your content in a way that you can bring it into some of these drag and drop editors, and that it's versatile and you can build upon it.
Yes, yes. And for a little context, I've actually never built a drag and drop editor tool. I mean, I've done little like proofs of concept and all of that, but I've spent more than 10 years thinking about content modeling for websites. And I think this question came up, I believe was originally proposed to you. And I think a lot of the motivation there is there seems to be kind of this like mysticism of what the heck is going on? How does all of this black magic happening? And and the answer is, depending on the tool you pick, the implementation details are likely a little bit different from tool to tool for sure. But it kind of all comes down to content, how you're modeling your content, having structured content. And if you set that as the foundation, then you can essentially do anything on top of that. And I'm sure we'll get into the details, but kind of wanted to set the stage there.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think too, maybe we keep on mentioning drag and drop editors, but what are some examples? I know when we were speaking before, we talked about Squarespace. What are some other examples that come to mind?
Yeah, and I don't have a ton of experience using these tools specifically. I think Squarespace is one. I believe there's other tools like Wix, and then I think you could probably put Webflow or various aspects of WordPress into this mix. And then I think that you might also consider from there, you could think about, or I guess what I should say is the concept that we're talking about also applies to other tools that might not necessarily be considered drag and drop, but also have this appearance of no code, low code when you're editing. So things like actually Notion follows a very similar process in terms of how this content is structured. And then us at Stackbit, we're doing something very similar as well. You're not literally dragging and dropping, but the effect is very much the same. You get some visual feedback for moving elements around a page in real time.
When you say going back to Notion, I think that's really interesting because it's something that so many of us use every day, and it's such a popular tool right now. What do you mean? I never would think of Notion to be included in this. So how does that relate to the way your content is modeled?
Okay, yeah. So that's a good question, and it does feel like it exists in this other category because it's not really built to be a thing that you build sites for. But what's really interesting, and I wrote a post a few weeks ago, I think I published it. And the idea there is like what the point I was trying to make in that post was why is Notion so popular? Why did it catch on?
Mhm.
And the argument I was making is because it's really finding this nice fine line between building something that developers can really make use of and something that non-technical people can make use of as well. And that's getting into an entirely different topic. But to answer your question, Notion is under the hood backed by structured content. And the thing that kind of like opened the door for Notion and for developers to love Notion was them releasing their public API. So before the API was available to developers, you basically could only use Notion in Notion, building tables, databases, et cetera, but you couldn't get any of that information out in any easy sort of way. And then they released the API, and all of a sudden Notion could be a CMS-like tool. You could use it and repurpose the data in any way. And so because of that, and because of the approach they take with structured content, you can think of Notion as being a CMS, like almost like a headless CMS. And I kind of put it in that category of drag and drop, because you can actually literally drag and drop things. You can pull an image from your computer, drop it onto the page, and it becomes a Notion block. And then you can drag and you can move those sections around. And so that might actually be a decent analogy to stick with as we move throughout this conversation, because Notion is probably, I think it's really accessible. People know it very well, but it's also, it takes this concept and really simplifies it. And then, we can talk about how that could apply to some of these tools that might appear a little bit more complex, like a StackBit, or like a more classic visual editor, like you mentioned, Squarespace earlier.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, let's dive into that. And I have one more question, and then I want to dive into what you just said about how that can apply to other tools that we were just mentioning. But I just one question, and maybe there's no such thing as silly questions, but why does it, but why does it even, what is the word? Why does it even matter to structure your content? Like, why are we having, what I mean? Like, why is this such a big deal? And it is a very big deal. There are tons of articles, blog posts, studies around this, but why, like, how would you describe why it's a big deal in your own words?
It's a very big question. I think that I think it certainly matters for a lot of reasons, and those reasons can change depending on who you are and the problem that you're trying to solve. I think at the very basic level, you could think that, okay, if you don't have structured content, how do you get content on the web? Well, you have to write HTML code, and nobody really likes to write HTML code and put content in there. It's super messy. As a developer, it's just ugly and not a good experience. As someone who's not a developer, it's confusing because you're basically writing code to write content. And so I think at the very core level, it's just a more pleasant editing experience, regardless of whether you're using a CMS or just markdown files, but having some structure, or specifically, I guess not that the structure doesn't come in until the next step, but specifically separating your content from your code. And then why to structure it? I think that there are a number of benefits to structuring it. One, it can make the code that you're building your website with can be, it can streamline the code you're writing so that you can, we talk a lot in basic development principles about writing dry code or trying not to repeat yourself. And so if you have a number of pages that are, that follow a very similar pattern that you're designing, then you can write theoretically one template, have the same structure of content, and then feed that content into this template and just generate a page. And so that's kind of like the foundation of CMS. That concept has existed for 25 plus years. And probably slightly more recently, maybe within the last 10 years or so, we've seen this explosion of popularity of building with components. And we had done that previously, but it became much more popular, and largely thanks to these drag and drop editors. We can think about the way that a web page comes together, or the way that you might break down a web page is very much by breaking it down into sections or components, more or less. And so, how do you then take something that is section based and modular, like most web pages are, and pass on the ability to edit that content to someone who's not technical? The way you get there is by representing those components with structured content, more or less. I don't know if that hopefully that kind of sets the or gives a kind of a broad strokes answer.
That was a very, very difficult question to ask, because it was way too big, and you really nailed it. So thank you.
All right. Great.
But I want to go back to, can we go back to the Notion example? Because like you said, that's something that everyone's really familiar with. And I think as a visual learner, I can like visualize what you're talking about, going through Notion and dragging and dropping, or dragging and moving different things. And you mentioned that with Notion and it offering structured content, how that can play into other tools. Can you kind of expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. So with Notion, you have these very basic building blocks. In fact, I was just thinking about this the other day. With Notion, the majority of the components you're going to add are kind of have one-to-one parity with primitive elements that we use on the web every day. So you can add a paragraph block, which is just the default block if you start typing. You can also add unordered lists or ordered lists or images, and these are HTML. I mean, these also exist as just primitive HTML elements. And so in Notion, it's like you have this nice interface to build these block level components that are available in any website that you can represent as an HTML, or that you can represent with an HTML tag. And so it's got this appearance of being super, super simple because these are these basic primitive elements. But what it's really doing is every time you hit enter or return on your keyboard, you're creating a new block. And so in Notion, you go to a new line, you've actually created this new record in the Notion database, and it is a block. And that block has a type. The type might be paragraph or divider or list. And so each page that you create in Notion is basically just this series of blocks. And so if you think about how that might be modeled in a database, and I don't know how Notion's database is architected, but you could think that you would have a table that could just be pages, for example, and that each page would have this relationship to blocks. Each page would have many blocks. And so every block on your page is represented by this record in a database. And so when you move one of these blocks up or down, then your page record is going to change to reflect the order of those blocks. And the reason I say this is still related to how a drag and drop editor might work is because that concept it's the same concept that we use at StackBit when we make things editable, visually editable and inline editable. It's likely the same concept that folks at Squarespace or other tools are using. So you have these sections on the page, and these sections are represented by elements in your CMS, or maybe records or entries in your CMS, in your database, or whatever content source you're using. And with Notion, these things look really simple. They're paragraphs, but then now just imagine them turning into complex components. So rather than adding a paragraph block, you added an image gallery block. And then so in Notion, there's this concept of children also, which is, think of how to represent this. Okay, so you would add a list of, let's say you're going to add a bulleted list or an unordered list. So you make that list in Notion, and then you want one particular list item to be indented another level. Well, that action of indenting the bullet in the database in Notion, what it actually does is it takes the block of the indented the block of the indented list item
Mhm.
and makes it a child, gives it a child relationship to the list item that is not indented, if that makes sense. You can do the same thing with paragraphs or with whatever. And so if you translate that idea to something that's more complex, like I'm going to build this big, it could be an image gallery, it could be a hero component, it could be just these like really complex sections. And those sections might have subcomponents inside of them, like a button or an image or something like that. And that you could have that same relationship. It's just that you might have more fields in one particular table in your database or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great way. When you break down how Notion works as far as how the content is structured, it's a really good visual and easy way to understand it, because it's something that we all, or the majority of us, have used. And I can see when you're talking about those bullet points and then how it's a child element within that bullet point, like the sub bullet point. I can actually see that. And actually, speaking of that, I'll link down. I know you mentioned you wrote a blog post on this, and I actually read. I read it at a high level. I need to dive into it though more, and it was really interesting. So I'll link it down below for everyone to check out as well. And I think one final question I have for you. I have an infinite number of questions, but for this call,
Okay.
for this call, it's kind of the what came first, chicken or the egg. When someone is starting to think about structured content, do they pick their, in this case, drag and drop editor first, or do they structure their content first?
That's a really interesting scenario. I think the way I would instruct somebody, if somebody's like, I'm going to build a website, well, yeah, what do I do first? I think it depends on what your how do I want to say it? One of the first one of the first steps we take when we're thinking about building a new website is, what is my stack? And in some cases, it's really important to answer that earlier on. And in other cases, it might be okay to wait. And then you also might have a situation where there are tools that you already have to use because you're working on a team that is using these tools. And so I think that you also are going to make decisions on which element you're going to bring into your stack at different times, depending on your scenario, the team you're working with, the client you're working for, et cetera. So it very much depends. I think that when it comes to, say, so yes, this is my classic, it depends, but let me give you a few scenarios.
Yeah.
When it comes to visual editors, this is kind of a tip, or we're talking about drag and drop editors. This is a specific class of tool.
Mm-hmm.
It depends which tool you, I'm trying to think of way. Okay, to answer what you said, getting back to your question, which is what would I do first? Would I structure content first, or would I choose the tool first? The reason I'm kind of fumbling around is because different tools have in this same space have different audiences or the different types of users. Okay, so what I mean is Squarespace or a Wix or that kind of class and style of tool is very specific to, it serves mom and pop shops really well. It serves little companies or individuals that don't have a developer, they don't want to write any code, they don't need to change the template much at all. In that case, you're not going to have a developer involved. Two, you can rely on pre-existing templates. You're not really going to customize the site much for what's beyond the template. If that's your use case, then you're probably picking the tool first, because you're actually not ever going to even mess with the structured content at all. If you're going to get a developer involved, then you're going to more than likely, you're going to think about the architecture of your application first, and then kind of fit the tools into your preferred architecture in most cases.
Mm.
And we've seen that a lot at StackBit, that we'll have, and it varies there as well. We have folks who we have customers who have come in and said, we want a new website, and they're choosing StackBit before they're actually writing any code for their site. And then that choice, we can help kind of influence them to set up their data structures in a way that it makes it really nice and easy to work with, potentially saves them some money in their content source bill, and that sort of thing. And in other cases, someone might have an existing website. It might be structured really well, and they can just kind of plug StackBit into it. And then if I mean, there's so many scenarios here. Another example is, hey, I really love Notion. I'm already doing everything in Notion, so I want to use Notion as my CMS, and I don't need any other tool. Well, in that case, you're actually not really going to worry too much about the structure of content, because the content's kind of already structured for you. I mean, you might need to get more customized and do a little bit of magic. And I'm working on a series of posts that are actually going to talk about how you can do some complex content modeling with just what you get out of the box with Notion. But anyways, I kind of danced around a few different examples, because I think this is a question that very much just depends on the use case. Yeah.
That makes sense. I think, no, that's a really good breakdown of it, though. I appreciate that. I think I asked you today some really big questions that you were able to condense, which just shows, in my opinion, how, I think those questions for most people would take like an hour each to answer. So thank you for being able to condense them down. And I'll work on asking questions that are not, you could write a novel on, I promise. But thank you for explaining them in such a friendly way. And I always love connecting with you, because I feel like every time I leave a chat, I always learn something new. And for those who are watching, please leave down in the comments any other questions you have for myself or Sean. We'll be monitoring them. We always check them. We also are on Discord. I'll link our Discord. And Sean, I'll see you for our next Learning in Public.
Fantastic. And yeah, I think we spent a lot of time on the theory and fairly high level here. So if folks are interested, we could do more of a screen share, or get more specific, like really dive into examples in future sessions, if that's something that's of interest.
Yeah, definitely. And leave down below if this is of interest to you. I know for me, once you're done writing those blog posts you mentioned, diving into this topic around Notion with those examples, I think that'd be a really interesting Learning in Public to go through that once you're done. So anyways, we'll see what everyone else says, but I think it'd be really cool.
All right, great. Yeah. Appreciate this tip. This was a lot of fun. I've been thinking about this for many years, so I can talk about it forever.
I know. Well, first live stream out of many to come. So lots of great conversations to be had.
Awesome.
Thanks, Sean. Bye.
All right. Bye, Tiff.